What's up, you guys? Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, I want to talk to you about the top things that I learned taking Harvard's Introduction to Python CS50 course as a self-taught programmer. Obviously, I have a YouTube channel that is basically dedicated to STEM tutorials, various programming concepts, a lot of Python, as well as Arduino, and a smattering of other topics. And I'm completely self-taught in the world of programming. I went to school for mechanical engineering, so I have a background in the sciences, but not really programming. The only formal class I ever had was an introduction to MATLAB, which honestly wasn't really enough to get me engaged in programming. So when I started self-teaching Python, it was sort of a slow process, and I did use YouTube and a lot of online resources for learning that process. So when Harvard started uploading a few of their computer science, CS50 is what they call the course, when they started uploading a lot of those videos in partnership with the giant channel Free Code Camp, I was pretty excited, but these are like 24-hour videos, 16-hour videos, and so I started checking them out, and I figured this is a long video. Maybe a lot of my followers and subscribers would see that and they'd be interested, but they wouldn't want to watch the whole thing. I did watch the entire 16 hours of Harvard's Introduction to Python Programming, and so this is kind of a breakdown of what I learned and what I think I got exposed to that maybe self-taught programmers have a slightly harder time. So I'm going to break it down by lecture, episode by episode, and we're just going to go through sort of a quick review of each lesson. And I also want to throw out there, I took about 12 pages of notes as I was watching it, and you can find the link to that entire file in the description of this video. So if you do want the full list of notes as well, it's a lot more than I can talk about in this video, but I hope you find it useful as well. Okay, so I want to start with essentially episode 0. They start counting from 0, which is sort of a programming convention as well. You don't start counting from 1, you start counting from 0. A little bit of computer science-y fun, but I actually thought that was kind of a fun way to kick it off. They use VS Code or Microsoft Visual Studio as their IDE. They do mention PyCharm, which is what I usually use, and they just kind of talk about the benefits of autofill by hitting tab and a lot of things that I think any self-taught programmer can pretty easily get exposed to as well. So they dive right into functions and variables. They talk about arguments being the inputs to functions. Functions are pre-built operations. Honestly, episode 0 of most of the videos, I found the least new information in as a self-taught programmer, because there's really no way to get around learning most of the things he covers in episode 0. As a self-taught programmer, they talk about like indexes and just giving different examples of getting inputs from users and command line output and stuff like that. So still really, really great introduction. And if you're a total beginner, episode 0 is absolutely worth your time. But if you're kind of intermediate or you want to start learning new things, but you're an okay self-taught programmer, you could probably skip episode 0. It was really just background. Episode 1, which is conditionals, I found pretty interesting. Again, not really a lot of new stuff other than like they go on to greater than and equals, less than equals, equal to, which is two equal signs, not equal to. And how to use those for numerical comparison. They also touch a little bit on like Boolean comparison, so mostly yes, no Boolean expressions, and then does a lot of like minor differences and how to write the same equation in more efficient ways. So one thing self-taught programmers, including myself, sometimes struggle with is optimizing. Like you write code that works and you move on. Some people who've been following the channel for a long time have probably seen a lot of my earlier projects. Even I can objectively say it's spaghetti code. It sort of just works, but it wasn't written in a super optimal way. And he does discuss in this episode the importance of writing optimal code. And then one thing that actually is pretty useful was using match instead of stacks of elif. This is something I'll probably do a dedicated video on because Python, similar to other C-based languages which use switch case, Python lets you use match and case. and else. So basically, instead of a long series of else, elif, if you're using the same input to check for a whole bunch of things, you can do a match case, and that lets you sort of check if this value is 1, do this, 2, do this, 3, do this, etc., etc. So that was probably the biggest new sort of efficient takeaway that I got from episode 1. And then episode 2 dives into loops. Which as a programmer, loops are so super important. But again, if you're a self-taught programmer, you've almost certainly been exposed to loops. And so as a decent programmer, just not formally educated, it was still fun watching this video and everything, but there was not a ton of new information. It was interesting hearing like a professional talk about the actual different functionality for things, because like break is break lets you exit a while loop, and then like return works like break but also sends back a value. I kind of knew those things, but it's still interesting hearing like a professor on the subject explain what that's for. And they also use loops to introduce lists and dictionaries, so like key value pairs, which if you're a self-taught programmer, you may have found ways to avoid dictionaries completely by just using a number of lists and the indexing inside of lists. So episode 2 was really cool, and it is the one where I would say if you're an intermediate or beginner Python programmer, but you're a little bit self-taught, that's probably the first one where I'd say it's really maybe worth watching that one as well. Episode 3, which is exceptions, it was really short. It was like barely 40 minutes. And essentially exceptions are expecting your code to do certain things wrong and creating handling for that. And as a self-taught programmer, no formal training, this was probably a really important episode for me. I did recently dive into sort of a personal education on exception handling, so it wasn't brand new for me, but it is sort of interesting to hear them discuss like why you don't want to use just a general if exception case. You actually want to use like value error, type error, different specific types of error, which kind of helps you debug what's actually happening and going wrong. So exception handling was only about 40 minutes, and as a self-taught programmer, that is probably one of the most important things that you're not just going to need to do one day while you're writing code, but it's really important, and it helps you write a lot more robust programming. Episode 4 was libraries, and libraries were basically bringing in outside modules. And like I've done so many programs with Pygame and like Matplotlib and NumPy. So bringing in like outside libraries is something that as soon as you start building interesting programs or use any sort of graphical user interface, you were probably exposed to libraries already. He uses random and math and the sys library, and also talks about getting command line arguments in here, which I don't find particularly useful. I think command line arguments are for programmers who want to quickly run things, but in general, most of my programs I try to write where they'd be fun for someone else to use. So I try to handle user input in different ways, but it was still useful to see like sys argv as user interface. And then to kind of just show like pip and the and like the different package index function like pypi, pypi. He brings in cowsay, which is like an old ASCII art. You give it an input of something to say, and then it prints an ASCII cow saying it. It was sort of a silly thing to show, but he uses that to introduce like pip installer and different ways of using modules. And then also touches on APIs here and JavaScript object notation, so JSON. And that's really, really useful if you're creating APIs and functions that query against data in the internet. You need to know about JSON. And so that's really useful. But then also, probably the biggest takeaway from this episode as a self-taught programmer that was a big improvement over how I write code, and I will start using this, is if you're creating a function that has multiple .py files, the importance of using if underscore underscore name underscore underscore is equal to underscore underscore main underscore underscore, and then a main function in your own library that allows you to create multiple py files where the code inside of them will only run if they're the main file. Otherwise, you can address those functions and the whole code won't run until it's specifically called unless it's the main function. So that's a really useful concept, something that I hadn't really been exposed to. So I liked that one a lot. Episode 5 was unit tests, and I knew this was a thing. I don't typically do them for my programs because I'm not really a data scientist, and when I do run experiments or data analysis, it's usually for me, so I haven't had to build really robust test policies. But a unit test is basically creating code that checks your function that does something specific, and it's running a test in a whole bunch of different scenarios to see how your function would handle positive numbers, negative numbers, decimal numbers, zero case. What if someone inputs a string accidentally? And so the unit test was really, really useful as a self-taught programmer. I think he just uses creating a function that returns the square of a value. So one of my favorite things about the whole course is that the examples that they use are typically just so straightforward that you know right away if your code is working or not. And so he uses that to introduce really basic concepts, which is a great way of doing it, because if you try to introduce unit tests in a function that does Laplace transforms or some differential equations concept, then you're unnecessarily complicating what you're actually trying to teach. So I think this was a really, really valuable one as a self-taught programmer. He also finishes this episode by talking about packages where multiple .py files are stored inside a folder, and adding an underscore underscore init underscore underscore .py file is what tells Python that it's a package and not just a file or a module alone. So you can run pytest test, and pytest is going to search through your entire folder, look for tests, and automatically test it. So this was a super useful episode, and honestly, almost everything in it was new information for me, so I really liked that. Episode 6 was File I/O, and it's kind of funny that this one was reading and writing to text files and CSV files primarily, because those are some of the best, most popular videos on my channel: how to read from text files, how to write to text files, how to use Excel with Python. And so I knew a lot of the stuff in here. One really useful thing that I probably should have known because I've done lessons on it is the append function to editing text files. I've only done reading and writing to text files, but there's this option to just store additional information in it without overriding it. And that was the file open and then use A for append instead of R for read or W for write. And then CSV, using the CSV library. I had used OpenPyExcel library before, but not the CSV file library where you use csv.reader. So useful stuff. And if you're curious about using and saving data into the outside world, that is really useful. For me, I knew most of this one already, but that was mostly because I had chosen to learn a lot of these concepts already on my own. Episode 7 was a little bit weird. It was regular expressions, or regexes, and basically you are able to create patterns to check for valid inputs. And so he uses email as an example for almost the whole thing, and how to basically use these very specific characters like R, open parentheses, up caret, open bracket, up caret, at sign, close bracket, plus at sign, open bracket, and This one is just, it's so specific. You're going to have to watch this episode or look up some information on regexes if that's something you're curious on. I don't really have a ton of use cases for myself personally, and also I just kind of glanced at Stack Overflow, and people have created really good like email checkers and other sort of regexes, regular expressions for you. But it was super useful to understand what this is. And also now if I do ever need it, I know it's out there and I kind of know what it is. But regular expressions were essentially a way of checking and making sure that your inputs or outputs are in a specific format. So before you try to plug something into like a URL reader that's going to pull information from the internet, you can check that it's actually in the format of a URL. So again, definitely really, really useful. As a self-taught programmer, mostly doing like entertainment-based content and a little bit of data science, like there are use cases for it, but I think that one was very geared at professional Python programmers, which maybe someday I'll become, so I'll be glad I know about it. But for me, it was just great and useful information, a little bit weird, like it was kind of complicated and a ton of the syntax was almost like cryptic, very specific, and the professor even said like, most of the time, if he needs to create a regex from scratch, he's looking at the documentation. So I'm not going to dive too much into specific cases here, but that's sort of what that episode was on. And episode 8 was object-oriented programming, which I know about and I know a lot of the benefit of it, but hearing it from like an official source was really, really useful. This was almost a 3-hour-long episode, so like some of the tutorials, some of the lectures were like 40 minutes, 50 minutes, an hour. This one was like 3 hours. But he talks about like the different concepts and pillars of object-oriented programming, how this is the difference from like functional, which is passing functions around with arguments and inputs, and that Python gives you the flexibility to sort of do procedural, which is like top to bottom, functional, which is using mostly functions, or object-oriented, which, as it sounds, is using objects and classes. And so I use classes. My recent Donkey Kong video uses a ton of classes. And so I knew about this stuff, but to hear kind of the pillars like abstraction and just go in depth what that actually means, what the benefit of it is a really useful one. So this was a 3-hour-long lecture. I can't really go too in-depth on all of the specifics other than to say like he touches on abstraction, which is basically you just make a class or an object or a function and you say this is going to work like X. And then you don't worry too much about writing that function. You more create a high-level vision of how you want your program to work, and then abstract away all the detail piece by piece, and then you build that up over time. And then another one of the pillars was inheritance, which is basically saying you can write a more generic class that does a lot of the sort of setup of a object for you. So like I think he uses a lot of examples from Harry Potter, but he says like you could have an example of person or wizard, but then beneath that you have like student and professor. So maybe every person or every wizard is going to have like name, what house in the school they belong to, and then age or something like that. But then the students are also going to have something like a patronus, and then the professors are all going to have a class that they teach. And so you can define a lot of that common shared stuff in a parent class that then the subclasses inherit. So the object-oriented programming was a really useful episode. Close to the end of it, it was the second to last episode, but as someone who has always kind of wondered, am I using Python to the best of its ability, or am I writing Pythonic code, and slowly over time been working on making it more Pythonic, this was really, really key in understanding some things I can use to get better going forward. And then episode 9, they just call etc., which I really like. It's basically and the rest. It was 2.5 hours long, and they stuffed so much stuff into it where for the majority of it, they're just odds and ends and tidbits and things that we didn't dive into in depth in the course. And he basically says, like, these are things you'll probably run into as you need them. And I really enjoyed the episode because his point wasn't trying to teach us to do a ton of things. His point was saying, like, okay, read the Python documentation. There's probably a library that's been made for the problem that you're having before. He talks about the importance of breaking complicated problems down into like solvable bite-sized tidbits, because that is the most important thing about being a scientist or an engineer, is critical problem solving and breaking complicated problems down into attainable tidbits. So I really liked etc. He does some fun things too. They use Cowsay at the very end and the text-to-speech module, which I've done a tutorial on, to say out loud, "This was CS50" to like exit, which I also watched their like very generic introduction to computer science, which they also did, and they ended like every episode with "This was CS50." So I guess my biggest takeaway from the last episode is that someone else has run into almost every problem that you're having in Python, and you have to not be afraid to go to the internet, look at Stack Overflow, look for a GitHub repository, find someone else who's solved the same problem as you, and there's probably a much faster way than writing it from scratch. That doesn't mean that creating your own programs from scratch isn't a great way of getting more knowledgeable about the solution that you're proposing. But it's just to get you sort of thinking that, is there an easier way? And there usually is. And so overall, I just have to say it is unbelievable to me that as a self-taught programmer, I can literally follow along with lectures from Harvard University on YouTube, thanks to the giant channel Free Code Camp, and also Harvard just putting this out there for public consumption. I know there's some bitter people who are going to be like, yeah, well, they're profiting off of ads. Who cares? Watch some ads and get a college course from one of the best universities in the world. Okay, so before getting all bitter, just stop a little bit and be appreciative of the age that we are living in and the skills that you can develop completely for free. I wonder at what point I'm going to have to stop calling myself a self-taught programmer if Harvard keeps rolling out their content for free and I keep finding the time for watching it. So if I had one takeaway from the entire thing, it's that as a self-taught programmer, if you are constantly challenging yourself to learn new things and develop new skills, you can get all the way to where a formally educated programmer is. It's going to take you a lot more time. And so having a little bit of structure can be just so useful. Thank you so much to Professor David Malin, the entire Harvard CS50 and computer science department, and Free Code Camp for making these resources so readily available. I found it super engaging. Again, my entire 12 pages of notes from watching the entire course will be available at a link in the description, as well as the full course from Harvard. And so if you need it, or you want to check out those notes, or you want to engage in the comments and talk about your takeaway, or if you took something else important away from the lesson, just let me know. I love having those conversations in the comments below. Thank you guys so much for 5,000 subscribers. We recently hit it on the channel, and I really appreciate all of the comments, all of the likes, all of the support. And until next time, bye.